Welcome to InspireChange, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Hey, welcome everybody. Another week's passed, so we're back to another episode of InspireChange. So in the last podcast, I spoke about the issue of men needing to pay attention to get physical checkups. And I also brought into play the idea of mental health checkups. Didn't really touch on that a great deal. And in the beginning of that podcast, I talked a little bit about it being a deviation from, the coronavirus pandemic and how to cope with that. But I want to briefly go back to that because I've been seeing something through both the media, but also within my own living space that concerns me a bit. Now, as this pandemic has been rolling along, I decided to look at whether there's a particular pattern that's unfolding with respect to what's happening to individuals and communities. And it came to me that essentially we're going to be looking at 4 stages of emotional adaptation to the Covid-19 virus and the pandemic. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and then if we've got time, touch on some of the ways to cope with this. So the first stage that I observed in people was fundamentally shock and then an adrenaline rush. Now the shock wasn't like a shock when, you almost get hit by a car. It was a sort of slow dawning and then suddenly a realization that it is here. Now, the adaptation to that essentially was to get into a bit of overdrive, and I particularly saw that with people who were transiting from working away from home to working at home. And I think it'd be reasonable to say that part of that adaptation, apart from getting physically organized in the home to deal with this, was to actually really get into overdrive. We were going to do lots of stuff. So we, set up desks, workspaces. We got the, home organized in such a way that, the kids could have some space because they were also going to be working from home. And there was a lot of adrenaline in this. So I talk about the stage 1 being shock and adrenaline rush. And in fact, some of that's borne out by the reality that for many, many people, performance actually improved. Now, I can explain that in a number of ways. A lot of people work in open plan offices with lots of people around them. And so suddenly being at home, you're generally speaking not in open plan. So you have some privacy. But secondly, you also don't have the interruptions and disruptions from co-workers the way that you do in the office. So people were able to concentrate, focus more, and really get some of their work nailed very, very, very quickly. And that was very useful in many respects. And here was the problem. A lot of people had very little idea how to structure that working from home process so that's effective over the long term. Short term, we can have all sorts of bursts of energies and get lots and lots of stuff done. But the question is, can you sustain it? Okay, so that was a big issue. Stage 2 set in, and that was suddenly about fear and anxiety. So let me talk a bit about fear, and I think you might have heard me in other podcasts talk about fear being our reaction to a real threat, whereas anxiety is our reaction to an imagined threat, fundamentally. It's also about the future, right? Anxiety when we're anxious, We focus on what happens in the future. What if this happens? What if that happens? And so on. Now, in that particular stage, lots of different stuff was happening. People were, working with the whole idea about social isolation, social distancing. We were struggling with getting certain basic supplies and worrying about whether we're going to have those supplies. As you know, I'm a little bit facetious when I talk about the big toilet paper debacle of 2020. But, in many respects, there was a real aspect to that because we were looking at disruptions to the supply chain and also how to get essentially to the shops, especially if you were an elderly person or you were in the high risk bracket. So again, there was certain information that was coming out that had the capacity to raise our fear and anxiety. Now, at a certain point, fear and anxiety will interfere with performance. So we get forgetful, and our short-term memory isn't quite as good. We struggle sometimes with, being able to deal with the sort of day-to-day problems in a way, or even the complex problems to do with work to the same capacity as we have been. And the next bit is quite often we start to struggle with making decisions. So people often would defer decisions. They would start to procrastinate about things and put them off. And again, the impact was that there was now suddenly a drop in performance. But also the other aspect to this was that in our interpersonal relationships, especially when we were closely housed, that fear and that anxiety drove some of our defense mechanisms. And one in particular, which is of concern to me in a lot of ways, is suddenly getting angry and then aggressive. Okay, so during stage 2, we were starting to see an increase in conflict between people at home because they couldn't get away from each other the way that they were used to. And we also saw that there was beginning to be an increase in domestic violence. And so that stage in particular started to raise some red flags. Now, we haven't quite got there yet, really, although I believe that we're starting to see some of the early markers for stage 3, which is what I called fatigue. Now, here in Australia, we have been exemplary in our capacity to keep the numbers low. So infection rates and deaths, comparatively speaking, are very, very low. Now that translates, unfortunately, in a lot of people's minds that we can get complacent. So the fatigue about being alert and conscious about what it is that we're doing with ourselves and in relationship to our immediate communities is becoming eroded. Now we're getting a bit fatigued about the whole thing about the rules and why we're doing this. And so suddenly, as people are talking in the media about, alleviating the sort of restrictions that we've been living with, people are starting to ignore them. So things like social isolation and social distancing is starting to be put aside. People are getting fed up with this. In the United States, obviously, we've got the odd phenomena, given the fact that they've got the worst numbers on the planet, that people are getting out there protesting about shutdown. And, they're talking about individual rights without considering what that really means on a social platform. So, in many respects, as far as I see it, the United States is very, very much entrenched in the fear and anxiety in stage 2. And they're not shifting into a place of fatigue. They're actually gearing up. Anger, aggression, and being combative is starting to emerge more there. Whereas what I'm seeing more locally here in Australia, or at least in my neck of the woods, is people are starting to get fatigued with the whole thing. They're starting to go, oh yeah, it's not that bad. I want to get back to my normal life. I want business to go back to, being able to, generate some income and some revenue. And so we stop paying attention. This is a critical problem because we're not yet, in my view, listening to the experts in this, out of the risk zone of a second wave. And so I want everybody to really think about this seriously. We still need to be very, very vigilant about what we're doing and about complying with the rules. And so we need to combat fatigue. Now, stage 4 is going to be about a recovery. And, our politicians are focused on the economic recovery. And my view is that if that's what they prioritize, they're missing the boat. We need to be looking at a social recovery, first and foremost, in which the priorities are about a spiritual and psychosocial, psychological shift within the thinking and emotional reactions of the community as a whole. Now, that's easier said than done. I see lots of memes on Facebook that raises the issue that we're not going to go back to normal because normal didn't work. And I firmly believe that's true, except I'm a little bit more cynical, and that is I think that our leadership, and especially political and corporate leaders of the multinational organizations, the mega corporations, are going to try and force normal back onto us when in fact we shouldn't be going back there. We need to think about this far more deeply and considering a risk management approach that looks at the future, because the fact of the matter is, as it's been pointed out over 20, 30 years, we're going to have these epidemics and pandemics again, and it will very much depend on how each country, how each nation deals with that. Now, the problem is that in the current economic rationalist countries, the neoliberals, they're overemphasizing individualism. So it's I-centric. So it's all about me. It's not about the community. So it's inconveniencing me, so therefore it needs to stop. And those nasty people in power need to pay attention to that. Otherwise, we're going to revolt. In the United States, I'm seeing pictures where people are going to protests fully armed. To me, that's a real concern, because if you put anxiety together with irrationality and a lack of education, and you give people a gun, the chances are that's going to turn really bad. So I'm very pleased to be in a country that has very strict gun control, because we're not going to see that. We will see other forms of aggressive acting out, but not, with an M16 or a military style weapon. So our recovery is going to be really, really critical. And we need to think about each stage and how we maneuver that, because like each of these sort of stage models, it's not stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 in a clean, discrete hierarchy or process. We're going to have overlap. Some people are going to be further advanced than others. Some communities are going to be further advanced than others. But one of the main things I think that we're going to need to really explore and understand is to understand emotional discipline. We're going to need to be able to understand being physically and socially disciplined. We can't just let it hang out there and go with whatever it is that we feel. Because at this point in time, if we're frightened and if we're fatigued, our monkey brain takes over and it becomes more and more irrational, and it will make the situation progressively worse and worse and worse, even when there is no more threat from the actual virus. So what do I mean by emotional discipline? Well, firstly, I think it's important to understand that the way that we think influences the way that we feel, and that feelings are fundamentally temporary. Now, they hang around if we overly attach ourselves to those. One of the lessons in Buddhism in a very simplistic way is that suffering arises from attachment. And I read that as attachment to negative thoughts, negative feelings, and negative actions. So keeping it as simple as that, we need to let go of those. We need to understand how we can change how we think in order to influence our feelings, our emotions in a constructive way. So rather than being angry, I could feel frustrated, which is a lot less than feeling really, really pissed off. Because it's easy to go from pissed off to being aggressive and then violent because we become enraged. So this is really critical. This is crucial. Even in Hamlet says things are neither good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Now, there's obviously stuff that's really, really bad. And it doesn't matter how I think about it, it's not going to make it any better. And so we need to be realistic. We need to be objective. We need to be rational. And from there, we need to be able to allow our emotions to be understood and dealt with in an appropriate way. So self-awareness, and I'll come back to this time and time again, self-awareness is critical, but it's also self-awareness about what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, what I'm doing. And then I need to go back and think about how and why am I thinking about it this particular way. In psychology, we talk about metacognition, the idea about thinking. And it's time we did a lot more of that, because what's coming out of the mouths of some of our leadership is just downright nonsense, and it's dangerous nonsense. And it's confusing and it's destructive. We need to focus spiritually on a time and place where we have become reintegrated as a community, irrespective of religion, creed, colour, wealth. These divisive aspects in our culture need to be managed. So, pure individualism and my, supposed pursuit of my own happiness ain't going to cut it. So the time is now to step up and abandon those projects. Happiness is temporary. Satisfaction is long-term. Kindness, generosity lays down a place of being that's sustainable as a community, not just for us as individuals. And so this is the thing that I want you to reflect on. Now, by the way, before I finish off, if there was any guys out there, and if I had any influence from the last podcast for you to go and get a physical checkup and start thinking about this, then I've done my job. Basically, in a sense, I could retire now. So I'd be really interested if any men out there have taken up that challenge to do that. And if so, maybe get in touch and let me know what your experience was like. So until next time, this is Gunter signing off.
Thank you, Gunter. And thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Again, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for a show, you can email development@noirtainment.com. That's development@noirtainment.com. Thank you, and thank you for listening.
Love can take us so high.